Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore the history of Christmas traditions around the world, a saga that stretches far beyond the twinkling lights of the modern shopping mall, reaching back into the primordial darkness of human history. We invite you to close your eyes and transport yourself to a time before electricity, when the winter night was a living, breathing entity that threatened to swallow the world whole. This is not merely a story of candy canes and stockings, it is a chronicle of humanity's desperate, beautiful attempts to conquer the dark with light, to replace silence with song, and to find warmth in the coldest season of the soul. From the blood-soaked altars of ancient Rome to the quiet majesty of a Judean stable, and from the rowdy banquets of medieval England to the Victorian parlors that defined our modern nostalgia, this is the epic origin of the world's most beloved holiday. Chapter 1: The Solstice Fires and the Fear of the Dark. Long before the first church bell rang out across a snowy valley, the peoples of the ancient world looked up at the sky with a growing, gnawing terror as the days grew short. To the prehistoric mind, the winter solstice was not a date on a calendar, but a cosmic crisis. The sun was retreating, the earth was dying, and the encroaching ice seemed to promise an eternal night. Imagine the tension in a Neolithic village, where the elders gathered around a dying fire, wondering if their prayers and sacrifices would be enough to coax the sun god back from the abyss. It was out of this primal fear that the first great winter traditions were born, forged in the desperate need to light a flame against the void. In the freezing forests of northern Europe, the Norsemen celebrated Yule, a festival that was as harsh and rugged as the landscape they inhabited. They believed that during the longest nights, the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, allowing the terrifying wild hunt, a ghostly procession led by the god Odin, to ride across the sky. To ward off these spirits and ensure the return of the sun, families would drag massive logs into their homes, setting them ablaze to burn for 12 continuous days of feasting and drinking. The sparks from the Yule log were thought to predict the fortunes of the coming year, a fiery divination that tied their survival directly to the wood they burned. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the south, the mighty Roman Empire was exploding into the riotous chaos of Saturnalia, a week-long festival beginning on December 17 in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture. It is hard to believe, but for this brief window, the rigid, iron-fisted social order of Rome was completely overturned. Masters served their slaves at the banquet table, and the courts of law were strictly closed. It was a time of legalized anarchy and excessive indulgence, where the streets echoed with the shouts of Io Saturnalia, and the city drowned itself in wine, gambling, and masquerades. This was not a holy night of silent reverence, but a cacophony of human release, a collective scream against the gloom of winter. Yet, beneath the drunken revelry of Rome and the smoky halls of the Norsemen, there was a shared, poignant symbol, the use of evergreens. While all other trees withered and stood like skeletons against the grey sky, the fir, the holly, and the ivy remained stubbornly, miraculously green. Ancient cultures brought these boughs into their homes not just as decoration, but as sympathetic magic, a way to capture the spirit of life and ensure that nature would wake from its slumber. These green branches were a promise, a whisper from the earth that death was not the end, and that spring would eventually conquer the frost. As the Roman Empire expanded, it absorbed the solstice traditions of the cultures it conquered, creating a melting pot of winter rituals that would eventually lay the groundwork for Christmas. The Persian cult of Mithras, popular among Roman soldiers, celebrated the birthday of the unconquered sun on December 25, a direct challenge to the darkness of the solstice. It was a time when the boundaries of faith and geography blurred, merging into a singular, universal longing for the return of the light. We see here the DNA of our modern holiday, the lights, the greenery, the feasting, already fully formed centuries before the Nativity story was ever told. The transition from these pagan festivals to a Christian holy day was not an accident, but a moment of profound cultural alchemy. The early world did not easily give up its fires and its feasts. The rhythms of the solstice were written into the blood of the people. To understand the history of Christmas, one must first understand this deep, ancestral connection to the turning of the year. It was onto this ancient, moss-covered stage that a new story was about to step, one that would change the meaning of the winter light forever. Chapter 2: The Birth of a Savior and the Chosen Date. The story of the Nativity is familiar to billions, yet the historical mechanics of how the birth of Jesus of Nazareth became tied to December 25 is a tale of theological strategy and political genius. The Gospels of Luke and Matthew provide the narrative foundation, the star, the manger, the shepherds, but they are conspicuously silent on the actual date of the event. Biblical scholars have long noted that shepherds would not have been watching their flocks by night in the dead of winter, as the sheep would have been corralled to protect them from the freezing rain and cold. It is likely that the historical birth occurred in the spring or autumn, yet the early church found itself competing for hearts and minds in a world dominated by the spectacular pagan festivals we just explored. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus at Easter was the primary focus of worship, and his birth was barely noted, if at all. However, as the religion moved from the shadows of persecution into the halls of imperial power, church leaders realized they needed a counter-narrative to the raucous celebrations of Saturnalia and the birthday of the unconquered Sun. In the 4th century, Pope Julius I made a decision that would shape the course of history. He officially declared December 25th as the Feast of the Nativity. It was a brilliant masterstroke of inculturation, essentially overlaying a new Christian meaning onto the existing, deeply rooted habits of the populace. By placing Christmas on the solstice, the Church offered a powerful theological metaphor. Jesus was the true light coming into the world just as the physical sun began to wax in strength. The hymns and liturgies of the time are filled with this imagery, contrasting the dying light of the pagan gods with the eternal, rising light of the Christ child. It allowed the common people to keep their winter fires and their feasts, but it fundamentally redirected the object of their celebration from the sun in the sky to the Son of God. Imagine the profound shift in the atmosphere as the wild, chaotic shouts of Saturnalia were slowly replaced by the solemn, rhythmic chanting of Latin masses. However, this transition was neither immediate nor entirely smooth. For centuries, the holiday remained a strange hybrid of pious worship and holdover pagan customs. The Christ Mass was a solemn church service, yes, but as soon as the parishioners stepped out of the cathedral, they often returned to the boisterous eating and drinking that their ancestors had enjoyed. The Church struggled constantly to sanitize the holiday, railing against the heathen excesses that refused to die out. It is a testament to the stubbornness of human culture that the holly and the ivy, once sacred to Druids, eventually found their place adorning the altars of the very faith that sought to convert them. The narrative of the Nativity itself, a humble birth in a stable, surrounded by animals and outcasts, provided a striking contrast to the pomp and arrogance of Rome. Where Saturnalia celebrated the reversal of social order as a joke, the Christmas story presented it as a divine reality. The last shall be first, and the King of Kings is born not in a palace, but in a feeding trough. This emotional resonance gave the holiday a staying power that transcended the political maneuvering of the popes. It spoke to the poor and the marginalized, offering them a dignity that the old gods never did. By the time the Roman Empire fell, the date was set, and the fusion of traditions was irreversible. The Christian story had successfully colonized the winter solstice. Yet, as Christianity spread north into the Germanic and Celtic lands, it encountered new, fiercer traditions that would add yet more layers to the holiday. The Yule logs of the north were baptized, the evergreen trees were given new symbolism, and the Feast of the Nativity began to take on the flavors of a dozen different cultures. The stage was now set for the Middle Ages, where Christmas would evolve into a public spectacle of immense proportions. Chapter 3, Medieval Merriment and the Lord of Misrule. If you were to walk through the streets of London or Paris during a medieval Christmas, you would not find the quiet, domestic holiday we know today. You would find a riot. In the Middle Ages, Christmas was not a single day but a season stretching from Advent to Epiphany, a period where the harsh rigor of feudal life was suspended in favor of communal hedonism. The centerpiece of this revelry was the Lord of Misrule, a peasant or subdeacon appointed to preside over the festivities, mocking the nobility and leading the crowds in drunken games. It was a time when the social pressure cooker released its steam, a necessary explosion of joy in a life often defined by crushing hardship and labor. The great halls of kings and feudal lords became venues for conspicuous consumption, where the boar's head feast was the ultimate status symbol. To the sound of trumpets and drums, a severed boar's head, garnished with rosemary and holding a fruit in its mouth, was paraded into the hall as a trophy of man's dominion over nature. These banquets were colossal affairs, involving thousands of dishes, flowing rivers of ale, and entertainment that ranged from minstrels to acrobats. The divide between the rich and the poor was temporarily bridged by the custom of charity, as the leftovers from the Lord's table were distributed to the peasantry waiting at the gates. Out in the snowy streets, a different kind of tradition was taking root, the practice of warsailing. Groups of peasants would travel from house to house, specifically to the homes of the wealthy, singing loud, rowdy songs and demanding food and drink in exchange for a blessing of good health, ways heil. This was not the polite carol singing of the Victorian era, it was aggressive, bordering on home invasion, with lyrics that explicitly threatened mischief if the homeowners were stingy. "We won't go until we get some, so bring some out here," was not a polite request, but a demand from the laboring class to share in the bounty of the season. The church, meanwhile, tried to maintain the sanctity of the season with elaborate mystery plays and processions that retold the story of the Bible for an illiterate population. These plays were often performed on the steps of cathedrals or in market squares, utilizing spectacular special effects for the time, such as flying angels and mechanical stars. Yet, even these religious observances were often infiltrated by the bawdy humor of the streets, blending the sacred and the profane in a way that would shock a modern congregation. It's hard to believe, but priests in some regions were known to participate in the Feast of Fools, wearing masks and dancing in the choir stalls. This era also saw the rise of St. Nicholas, not yet the jolly Santa Claus, but a stern and gaunt bishop who was the patron saint of children and sailors. His feast day on December 6 became a time for gift-giving, a tradition that would eventually merge with the later Christmas celebrations. In the medieval mind, the supernatural was always close at hand. Christmas Eve was a night when animals gained the power of speech and bees hummed the 100th psalm in their hives. The world was magical, dangerous, and vividly alive, and Christmas was the peak of this enchanted reality. By the end of the Middle Ages, Christmas had become a juggernaut of cultural expression, a chaotic blend of Roman license, Germanic feasting, and Christian piety. It was loud, it was public, and it was intensely communal, a stark contrast to the private family gatherings of the future. But this unchecked merriment would soon face its greatest threat, as a wave of religious reform swept across Europe, bringing with it a dour skepticism of all things fun and festive. The fires of the medieval Yule were about to be doused by the cold water of Puritanism. Chapter 4: The Puritan Purge and the Victorian Revival. As the 17th century dawned, a dark cloud gathered over the festive traditions of Christmas, driven by the rise of the Puritans in England and America. These religious hardliners viewed the holiday not as a celebration of Christ, but as a popish survival of pagan idolatry, stained by the excesses of the Lord of Misrule and public drunkenness. When Oliver Cromwell and his forces took control of England in the mid-1600s, they did the unthinkable, they legally cancelled Christmas. Soldiers were ordered to patrol the streets of London, seizing food being prepared for feasts and arresting anyone found attending a special Christmas service. Imagine the silence that fell over the English winter. The churches were locked, the shops were forced to remain open, and the vibrant carols were replaced by the stern quiet of everyday commerce. In the American colonies, particularly in Massachusetts, the ban was even more draconian. Observing Christmas was a criminal offense punishable by a fine. For a generation, the spirit of Christmas was driven underground, kept alive only in the secret whispers of royalists and traditionalists who refused to let the old ways die. This was the true war on Christmas, a systematic attempt to scrub the holiday from the cultural memory of the English-speaking world. However, human nature abhors a vacuum, and the suppression of joy could not last forever. With the restoration of the monarchy, Christmas returned, but it came back bruised and diminished. It wasn't until the 19th century, during the reign of Queen Victoria, that the holiday underwent the spectacular metamorphosis that created the Christmas we know today. The catalyst was a young German prince, Albert, who married Victoria and brought with him the quaint tradition of the Tannenbaum, the Christmas tree. In 1848, a drawing of the royal family standing around a decorated evergreen was published, and almost overnight, every fashionable household in Britain and America rushed to bring a tree inside. Simultaneously, a literary genius named Charles Dickens was crafting a ghost story that would single-handedly reinvent the emotional core of the holiday. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, was not just a bestseller, it was a social manifesto that shifted the focus of Christmas from rowdy public feasting to private, family-centered charity. Dickens described a philosophy of Christmas, a time of kindness, forgiveness, and benevolence, that struck a chord with a society grappling with the brutal inequalities of the Industrial Revolution. He romanticized the snow, the turkey, and the hearth, creating an idealized vision of the holiday that provided a comforting counter-narrative to the smokestacks and slums of Victorian London. This era also saw the revival of caroling, but this time it was sanitized and domesticated. The aggressive beggars of the Middle Ages were replaced by polite choirs collecting money for the poor. The commercial Christmas began to take shape as well, with the invention of the Christmas card and the mass production of toys, turning the holiday into an economic engine. The Victorians effectively domesticated the wild beast of the winter solstice, taming the pagan fires into the gentle glow of candles on a parlor tree. They took a holiday that had been about survival and communal release and turned it into a celebration of the nuclear family and childhood innocence. By the turn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. The Puritans were a distant memory, and the Victorian model had become the global standard. Yet, as we look at our modern traditions, the lights, the trees, the gatherings, we can still see the layers of history beneath the surface. We are still lighting fires against the dark, still feasting to hold back the winter, and still hoping, like the ancients, for the return of the light. Chapter 5: The Saint, the Sinner, and the Evolution of Santa Claus. To understand the figure of Santa Claus, we must peel back layers of commercial varnish to reveal a history that is far stranger and more complex than a toy workshop at the North Pole. The journey begins not in the snows of the Arctic, but on the sun-drenched coast of modern-day Turkey, with Saint Nicholas of Myra, a 4th-century bishop known for his fiery defense of church doctrine and his secret generosity. Legend tells us he saved 3 impoverished sisters from a life of destitution by tossing bags of gold through their window under the cover of night, a clandestine act that sowed the seeds of the anonymous gift-giving tradition. For centuries, Nicholas was revered as a stern, holy protector, often depicted in red clerical robes, holding a staff, standing as a solemn guardian of children against the darkness of the world. As the centuries turned, this saintly figure migrated north and merged with the folklore of the Germanic and Dutch peoples, transforming into Sinterklaas. In the Netherlands, Sinterklaas was a majestic, imposing figure who arrived by boat from Spain, riding a white horse across the rooftops, listening at chimneys to judge the behavior of the household. It is hard to believe, but he did not travel alone. He was accompanied by a menacing sidekick known as Black Peter, or in other alpine regions, the terrifying demon Krampus. While the saint rewarded the good, these dark companions were there to punish the wicked, carrying birch switches and sacks to cart off naughty children, reminding us that the old winter festivals always balanced the promise of reward with the threat of retribution. The metamorphosis of this stern European bishop into the jolly American icon began in the cultural melting pot of New York City in the early 19th century. Writers like Washington Irving began to strip away the religious vestments of Sinterklaas, reimagining him as a portly, pipe-smoking Dutch burgher who flew in a wagon over the treetops. But the true turning point came in 1822, when Clement Clarke Moore penned The Visit from St. Nicholas, fundamentally rewriting the mythology of the season. Moore gave us the 8 reindeer, the twinkling eyes, the bundle of toys, and the chimney descent, softening the judgment of the saint into the unconditional love of a magical grandfather. By the time the Civil War tore America apart, the image of Santa Claus had become a unifying symbol of home and comfort, solidified by the illustrations of Thomas Nast. Nast, a political cartoonist, gave Santa his permanent residence at the North Pole, a place belonging to no specific nation, and filled out his suit with the now familiar red padding. This was a crucial evolution. Santa was no longer a specifically Catholic saint or a Dutch folklore spirit, but a secular deity of abundance who presided over a season of increasing material wealth. The industrial age had found its patron saint, one who distributed the fruits of the factories to children regardless of their social station. The final stroke of this transformation occurred in the 1930s, when the Coca-Cola Company commissioned artist Haddon Sundblom to paint Santa for their winter advertising campaigns. Sundblom didn't invent the red suit, as is often claimed, but he did standardize the face of Santa Claus as we know it today, rosy-cheeked, grandfatherly, and radiating a human warmth that transcended the supernatural. This image was exported globally through American movies and soldiers, eventually overriding local traditions in Europe and Asia. The ancient Bishop of Myra had essentially vanished, replaced by an omnipresent avatar of generosity who asked for nothing but cookies and belief. Yet, in the shadows of this global icon, the older, wilder versions of the gift bringer still survive in pockets of the world. In Austria, the Krampus run still terrifies spectators with masks of wood and bone, and in Italy, the witch La Befana still flies on her broomstick on the eve of Epiphany. These lingering traditions serve as a reminder that the winter season was once a time of mystery and fear, where the supernatural walked among us. Santa Claus may have conquered the world, but the ancient spirits of the solstice still haunt the edges of the holiday. Chapter 6: The Truce, the Trenches, and the Century of Conflict. As the 20th century dawned, humanity walked into an era of industrial warfare that would test the very soul of the Christmas message. The most poignant moment in the entire history of the holiday occurred not in a cathedral, but in the muddy, freezing slaughterhouse of the Western Front in 1914. 5 months into the First World War, with hundreds of thousands already dead, a miraculous silence descended over the trenches on Christmas Eve. German soldiers began to place small, candlelit trees along the parapets of their trenches, and the sound of still night, silent night, drifted across the desolate no-man's land. Imagine the tension in the British lines as they heard the enemy singing, not a war cry, but a hymn of peace that they recognized instantly. Slowly, tentatively, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their fortifications, unarmed, meeting in the cratered wasteland to exchange cigarettes, buttons, and plum pudding. For a few fleeting hours, the war machine was jammed by the sheer force of shared humanity. Men played football on the frozen ground and showed each other photographs of their families, realizing that enemy was just another man cold and far from home. The Christmas Truce of 1914 remains a haunting testament to the power of the tradition to transcend even the most brutal political hatreds, if only for a night. However, the 20th century also brought a different kind of conquest, the total commercialization of the holiday. Following the wars, the economic boom of the West turned Christmas into the Golden Quarter, the critical period upon which the survival of the retail industry depended. The department store window became the new stained glass, offering dazzling, animated displays that drew pilgrims not to the altar, but to the checkout counter. It was in this era that the concept of holiday stress was born, as the pressure to purchase, to decorate, and to perform the perfect family gathering began to weigh heavily on the modern psyche. This era also saw the standardization of Christmas music, thanks to the invention of the radio and the phonograph. Crooners like Bing Crosby and Nat King Cole created a sonic landscape of nostalgia, cementing the idea of a white Christmas even for listeners living in the tropics. These songs, written largely during the uncertainty of World War II, tapped into a deep, aching longing for stability and home that resonated with a displaced generation. The sound of Christmas became as important as the look of it, triggering emotional memories that could bring a grown man to tears in the aisle of a grocery store. Yet, even as the West embraced consumerism, other parts of the world were fighting to keep the spiritual flame alive under totalitarian regimes. In the Soviet Union and Communist China, Christmas was actively suppressed, viewed as a tool of bourgeois oppression and superstition. Icons were hidden in cellars, and the faithful risked imprisonment to light a candle for the Nativity, proving that the holiday's roots ran deeper than any government decree. The resilience of these underground celebrations created a stripped-down, intense version of Christmas that focused entirely on the theological hope of liberation. As the century closed, the holiday had become a global paradox. It was simultaneously a billion-dollar industry and a sacred, quiet hope, a time of gluttonous excess and a time of profound charity. The tension that began in ancient Rome, between the rioters' party and the solemn prayer, had not been resolved, but rather amplified by the megaphone of mass media. We entered the new millennium carrying this dual legacy, asking ourselves every year which version of Christmas would win out in our own hearts. Chapter 7: Latin America and the Passion of Las Posadas. Travel south from the snow-covered firs of North America, and the temperature rises, but the spiritual intensity of the season burns even hotter. In Latin America, and particularly in Mexico, Christmas is not merely a day, but a kinetic, sensory explosion of faith that blends Spanish Catholicism with indigenous vitality. The heart of this celebration is Las Posadas, a 9-night ritual reenactment of Mary and Joseph's desperate search for shelter in Bethlehem. It is a tradition that moves the story of the Nativity out of the church and directly into the dusty streets of the neighborhood. Imagine standing in a small Mexican town at twilight, holding a candle as a procession winds its way through the cobblestone alleys. At the front, children dressed as the Holy Family lead the way, followed by neighbors singing ancient litanies requesting lodging. They knock on designated doors, singing the part of Joseph, only to be rejected by the people inside who sing back the role of the innkeepers, denying them entry. This ritual rejection is crucial. It forces the participants to feel the sting of being an outsider, the anxiety of the homeless, making the eventual opening of the door an emotional climax of relief and welcome. When the door is finally opened on the last house, the solemnity shatters into pure joy, that in becomes a fiesta. The air fills with the scent of tamales steaming in corn husks, hot punch spiced with cinnamon and fruits, and the sound of children laughing. The star of the party is the pinata, originally a clay pot with 7 points representing the 7 deadly sins. To break the pinata is to symbolically destroy evil through blind faith, resulting in a shower of candy and fruit, the rewards of heaven raining down on the faithful. Further south, in countries like Colombia, the season begins with Dia de las Velitas, the Day of the Little Candles. Millions of candles and paper lanterns are placed on porches, balconies, and sidewalks, creating rivers of light that turn entire cities into glowing jewels visible from the air. This is not just decoration, it is a beacon, a way of marking the path for the Virgin Mary to bless their homes. The visual spectacle is matched by the auditory landscape. Cumbia and salsa music infuse the Christmas carols, creating a rhythm that demands dancing rather than passive listening. In Venezuela, a peculiar and delightful tradition takes place in the capital city of Caracas. On the mornings leading up to Christmas, the streets are closed so that thousands of people can roller skate to early morning mass. It is a surreal, joyful image, entire families gliding through the city at dawn, blending the sacred obligation of mass with the sheer fun of a street party. Afterward, they share halakas, savory meat pies wrapped in plantain leaves, a dish that requires days of communal family labor to prepare. These traditions highlight a fundamental difference in the Latin American experience of Christmas. It is intensely communal and public. There is very little silent night here. The holiday is lived out loud, with fireworks banging in the sky and doors thrown open to neighbors. It is a celebration that emphasizes the Holy Family as a reflection of the extended human family, reminding us that there is no room for isolation in the season of the Nativity. Chapter 8: The Orthodox East and the Old Calendar. As we move eastward into the Slavic lands and the ancient territories of the Byzantine Rite, the very date of Christmas shifts beneath our feet. For millions of Orthodox Christians in Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, and Ethiopia, December 25th is just an ordinary winter day. Following the older Julian calendar, which drifts 13 days behind the Western Gregorian calendar, their great feast arrives on January 7th. This separation has preserved a form of Christmas that feels ancient, mystical, and far less touched by the frenetic commercialism of the West. In the Orthodox tradition, the joy of Christmas is earned through the rigor of the Nativity fast. For 40 days leading up to the holiday, the faithful abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a physical disciplining of the body designed to sharpen the spiritual senses. This period of waiting creates a palpable hunger, both physical and spiritual, so that when the feast finally arrives, it is received with overwhelming gratitude. The culmination of this fast is the Holy Supper on Christmas Eve, a meal that begins only when the first star is spotted in the night sky, a direct celestial link to the Magi. Enter a village home in Ukraine or Russia during this Holy Supper, and you will find the floor strewn with hay or straw, a sensory reminder of the stable where Christ was born. The table is set with a white cloth representing the swaddling clothes, and 12 meatless dishes are served to honor the 12 apostles. The centerpiece is kusha, a ceremonial dish of boiled wheat, poppy seeds, and honey, representing the resurrection and the sweetness of life. The meal is eaten in a solemn, ritualistic atmosphere, often with an empty place setting left at the table for the spirits of deceased ancestors, bridging the gap between the living and the dead. In these lands, the figure of Santa Claus is replaced by Dead Morrows, or Grandfather Frost, a tall, slender figure in blue or white robes, often accompanied by his granddaughter, the Snow Maiden. Unlike the elusive Santa who slides down chimneys, Dead Morrows arrives openly at New Year's celebrations, greeting children in person. His survival through the anti-religious campaigns of the Soviet Union is a story of cultural adaptability. The Soviets tried to banish Christmas, but they could not banish the winter spirit, so Dead Morrows was secularized and moved to New Year's Eve, where he remains a beloved cultural icon today. Travel further south to Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian nations on earth, and the celebration of Gunnar on January 7th takes on a stark, majestic beauty. Pilgrims dressed in traditional white shama robes gather in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, engaging in services that can last all night long. The rhythmic beating of drums and the chanting of ancient GEZ liturgy create a hypnotic, trance-like atmosphere that transports the worshipper back to the earliest days of the faith. Here, there is no exchange of gifts, only the gift of presence and prayer. The Orthodox Christmas reminds us that the holiday is, at its core, a mystery to be contemplated rather than a party to be planned. The icons of gold and firelight, the smell of frankincense, and the haunting choral music speak to the part of the human soul that craves awe. It is a solemn, majestic counterweight to the flashing lights of the modern world, preserving the ancient reverence of the winter feast. Chapter 9, Christmas in Asia and the Neon Nativity. In the vast and diverse continent of Asia, Christmas is a fascinating shapeshifter, adapting to cultures where Christianity is often a minority faith. Here, the holiday has been decoupled from its strict theological roots and reinvented as a festival of romance, commerce, and spectacular illumination. Nowhere is this more evident than in Japan, where Christmas Eve has evolved into something akin to a second Valentine's Day. It is a night for couples to dine out, exchange jewelry, and stroll under the breathtaking winter illuminations that turn Tokyo's districts into landscapes of electric starlight. It is hard to believe, but one of the most entrenched Christmas traditions in Japan involves a bucket of fried chicken. In the 1970s, a brilliant marketing campaign by KFC convinced the nation that Kentucky for Christmas was the standard Western custom. Today, families place orders weeks in advance, and queues wind around the block for the Christmas party barrel. It is a quirky, purely commercial tradition, yet it speaks to the universal desire for a special, shared meal that marks the day as different from all others. The Colonel has, in a strange twist of history, become a surrogate Santa for millions. However, cross the sea to the Philippines, and you find a Christmas fervor that rivals any nation on earth. As the only predominantly Catholic nation in Asia, the Philippines boasts the world's longest Christmas season, with carols beginning to play on the radio as early as September, the start of the Burr months. The symbol of the season is the parol, a star-shaped lantern made of bamboo and paper that hangs in every window, representing the Star of Bethlehem. These lanterns are not just decorations, they are symbols of hope in a nation that often faces typhoons and economic hardship, a defiant light against the dark. The Filipino celebration peaks with Simbang Gabi, a series of 9 dawn masses held in the pre-dawn darkness leading up to Christmas. Whole communities wake at 3 a.m. to attend church, after which they spill out into the churchyards to eat bibingka, rice cakes, and drink hot chocolate. It is a grueling schedule of devotion that demonstrates the deep endurance of the Filipino faith. To complete the 9 masses is believed to grant a special wish, fusing religious discipline with personal hope in a way that binds the community together before the sun even rises. In China, where Christmas is not a public holiday, a unique indigenous custom has emerged among the youth, the giving of peace apples. Because the Mandarin word for Christmas Eve, Pinganyi, a night of peace, sounds like the word for apple, Pingwei, elaborate cellophane-wrapped apples printed with messages of love are exchanged between friends. It is a linguistic pun that has become a genuine gesture of goodwill, a new tradition forged in the fires of globalization and language. From the neon-soaked streets of Seoul to the shopping malls of Singapore, Christmas in Asia is a testament to the holiday's incredible plasticity. It shows us that the iconography of the season, the tree, the lights, the gifts, has a power that transcends religious boundaries. It has become a global language of generosity and light, spoken in 100 different dialects across the continent. Chapter 10, The Southern Hemisphere and the Summer Santa. Finally, we must turn our imagination upside down and journey to the Southern Hemisphere, where December falls in the blazing heat of high summer. In Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Brazil, the White Christmas is a physical impossibility, a colonial memory that clashes with the reality of the climate. Here, the winter solstice fires are replaced by the scorching sun, and the heavy woolen sweaters are swapped for swimwear. The psychological dissonance of singing in the bleak midwinter while sweating in 30-degree heat has birthed a unique, rugged adaptation of the holiday. In Australia, the traditional roast turkey dinner is often abandoned for the Christmas barbie, a barbecue on the beach featuring prawns, lobster, and cold beer. The ocean becomes the center of the celebration. Bondi Beach in Sydney is packed with thousands of revelers wearing Santa hats and bikinis, surfing the waves in a surreal display of festive hedonism. Yet, the connection to the British roots remains. Many families still stubbornly cook a hot roast lunch, sitting in air-conditioned rooms to simulate the feeling of a northern winter, a testament to the power of cultural nostalgia. One of the most beautiful traditions to emerge from the Southern Hemisphere is carols by candlelight. Beginning in Australia in the 1930s, this tradition involves massive outdoor gatherings in parks and amphitheatres on Christmas Eve. As the sun sets and the summer heat breaks, hundreds of thousands of people light candles, creating a sea of flickering flames under the Southern Cross. It is a communal concert that replaces the intimacy of the indoor hearth with the grandeur of the open night sky, turning the entire landscape into a cathedral. In South Africa, the blooming of the hydrangea flowers signals the arrival of Christmas, much like the holly does in the north. The day is often spent visiting family in the countryside, a migration that empties the cities. The Christmas beetle, a noisy insect that emerges in December, provides the buzzing soundtrack to the holiday, replacing the jingle bells of the Arctic. Here, the feast often includes malva pudding and brari meat, eaten outside in the shade of acacia trees. This sun-drenched Christmas challenges our northern-centric view of the holiday. It reminds us that the themes of the season, birth, light, family, are not dependent on snow or darkness. Whether it is celebrated in a blizzard or a heatwave, the core impulse remains the same: to stop the wheels of industry, to gather with those we love, and to celebrate the gift of life. The summer Santa, arriving on a surfboard or a jagged coastline, is proof that the spirit of Christmas is adaptable enough to survive in any climate. Closing summary. As we look back across the millennia, from the terrifying solstice fires of the Stone Age to the neon lights of Tokyo, from the blood-soaked trenches of World War I to the quiet prayers of an Ethiopian church, a single, golden thread emerges. The history of Christmas is not merely a history of religion or custom, it is a history of the human heart's refusal to surrender to the dark. We began this journey in the fear of the winter night, with ancestors who lit fires to beg the sun to return. We end it in a world illuminated by electric lights, yet the need remains exactly the same. We still crave connection in a fragmented world, we still long for a moment of peace in an age of conflict, we still look for a reason to give without expecting anything in return. The traditions we have explored, the trees, the feasts, the gifts, the songs, are simply the vessels we have built to carry this ancient hope across the generations. Christmas is the one time of year when the cynical world agrees to suspend its disbelief, to play at being better than we are, in the hope that the mask might eventually become the face. It is the season where we invite the stranger in, where we remember the poor, and where we look at the stars and dare to believe that love is the fundamental force of the universe. Whether you celebrate with a bucket of chicken, a solemn fast, or a noisy family banquet, you are participating in the oldest continuous ritual of hope in human history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you made it this far, you're the reason we keep going. Please subscribe and help us continue sharing these stories with the world.